ago, the broad American population was not scared of us brown folk. They were scared of another race, and they called them the yellow folk. They were scared of the Chinese, believe it or not, and they called this the yellow fear and the yellow peril. This was a term that was in vogue and common 100 years ago, the yellow peril. And I know it sounds ludicrous, but again, look this up, read in the books of history. 100 years ago, there was this notion that somehow the Chinese people are going to come over and overtake America. And so they began a series of media campaigns. The media and the politicians colluded together to whip up, stigmatize, stoke hatred and fear amongst the broader public. And the fact of the matter is that to a large extent, they succeeded for a period of time. They invented a stereotype about the Chinese people. And the stereotype was, and of course you understand, I'm quoting the stereotype, of course it's not true. The stereotype was that the yellow race is an inferior race. They're a dirty, unkempt, barbaric race. They are sexual predators without scruple and morale. That they intentionally plan to come over and breed like flies. That was another thing. They breed like flies. They rape women and they kill the men. And people actually believe that Chinese immigration would spell the end of the world as they knew it. So there are some parallels that we can draw from that period and ours so that we can better equip ourselves on how to manage what to do. The first parallel, the portrayal of the Chinese and the fact that media tycoons were at the forefront of perpetuating this evil, vicious stereotype. The editor of the New York Tribune, which was one of the most respected newspapers of the time, the editor in an op-ed wrote the following, and I quote directly from the newspaper: "The Chinese are uncivilized, unclean, and filthy beyond all conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations, lustful and sensual in their dispositions. Every female is a prostitute of the basest order," end quote. As well, cartoons and caricatures highly exaggerated Chinese features and portrayed them as somehow being lascivious, unkempt, and dirty. Popular books were written, and they became New York Times bestseller books. Books with the title The Yellow Peril or The Threat Against White Supremacy. Those are actual books. You'll still find them on PDF form, and you can simply download them. And the greatest media tycoon alive at the time, William Randolph Hearst. Many of you know his name. He owned 7 of the most prestigious and mainstream newspapers. William Randolph Hearst was instrumental in fomenting such a character, and he and his newspapers coordinated a sustained, systematic campaign of vilification against the Chinese. Now, the parallels to what we are seeing are obvious. The stereotypes are different. Alhamdulillah, they don't say that we're dirty and unkempt. I think they know we use the lota in the bathroom, but that's besides the point. But they do say that the stereotype is what? That we're vicious, that we're out to destroy Western civilization, that we're prone to violence, that we're inherently evil, that we want world supremacy and domination. So this stereotype is indeed being perpetrated by media tycoons, by Fox News and its constituents, by a particular family of media tycoons, and you all know who I'm referring to here. And the fact of the matter is that the media is always at the forefront of whipping up this type of fomentation of stereotypes. Now, when you're going to whip up the masses, what's going to happen? Pressure will be put on politicians, and that's exactly what happened 100 years ago. A number of laws were passed against the quote-unquote yellow race. Some of these laws were pretty explicit, such as, and I quote you the name of the law. The name of the law was the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a law passed called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Another law was passed called the Immigration Act. And by the way, for the immigrants here, and my father was an immigrant, and most of us here are immigrants, this Immigration Act of 1917, 100 years ago, this Immigration Act, 1917, targeted primarily Chinese countries. But incidentally, it wasn't intended, but incidentally, they also targeted Middle Eastern countries. And that is why Muslim immigration was Pretty much a constant trickle up until 1917. The first immigrants, other than the slaves that were forcibly brought here, the first immigrants to come came from 1880 to 1917. Then all of a sudden it stopped. Why did it stop in 1917? Because there was fear being fomented against the Chinese. And so the government passed legislation to ban the Chinese people from immigrating, and incidentally, the Ottoman lands, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, all of the other lands were also included. And that is why the Immigration Act effectively excluded all Muslims from immigrating, except the odd exception, until Ted Kennedy repealed that act in 1964. In 1964, this is what opened the door for a fresh wave of immigrants, and that is why so many Muslims began to immigrate once again in the mid-60s, because the act that was passed against the Chinese effectively banned 50 years of immigration to this land, except for the white countries, Germany and Sweden and Poland and Italy. They had a quota and they could come. But anybody from a brown or especially a yellow race was effectively banned. And we see the same thing right now, that the fomentation of hatred is whipping up politicians to pass laws that are very, very ridiculous, that are targeting Muslims. The Patriot Act is a very unconstitutional act. It is the most un-patriot act ever passed in our lifetime. But it is only being passed because of the fear that has been fomented up by the media. Politicians rose to fame and were elected to office on the promise of excluding Chinese people. A very famous politician by the name of Dennis Kearney in California won the senatorial position. He became the senator of California because he advertised himself on an anti-yellow platform. His slogan that caused him to win the election was, "The Chinese must go." That was his slogan, and guess what? The people fell for it. They voted in droves, and he won by a landslide. Need I compare him to Donald Trump and the other racists and bigots that we see fomenting the same hatred? Been there, done that. The same thing is happening right now. An evil person sees that it is possible for him to ride the wave, sees it's possible for him to get elected, and that is exactly what he does. And we see this with a number of politicians. It's not just Donald Trump. He's definitely at the forefront, but a number of politicians are now taking this to their advantage. Another similarity that we see was that when America began fomenting this anti-Chinese hatred, it wasn't just America. Many Western countries actually joined in the frenzy. In particular, Germany under the Kaiser, and eventually that would lead way to Nazism, eventually opened itself up as well to anti-Chinese bigotry. Australia, New Zealand, England, and other lands, it really was a domino effect that once one land began to speak about the Chinese people, all other Western lands felt a solidarity. They had to combine against the Chinese people. Well, guess what? We see the exact same thing right now. The exact same thing right now. When the Charlie Hebdo massacre took place, and we are opposed to the killing of those cartoonists, what happened? Almost every single world leader came together as if this was a threat to their civilization. Yet, when a number of other similar incidents happened, when a number of other cartoons that were dismissive of others took place, there was no such outcry of support. In fact, as you see right now, the rise of the KKK is coinciding with the rise of pro-Nazi parties in Germany. It's coinciding with the popularity of far-right parties across Europe. Once again, we see the Western powers, by and large, having what is called a confirmation bias. If Germany is doing it, so should we. If Italy is doing it, so should we. So when America is taking the Islamic cause to the anti-Islamic cause to such an unprecedented level, England and Germany and Sweden and all of these other countries are somewhat helping one another as if they are somehow collaborating. And the fact of the matter is that they have to exaggerate this threat like they did the exaggerated threat of the Chinese people. The fact of the matter is that there was never a threat of the Chinese people coming over and doing anything. SubhanAllah, the Chinese people, when they came over, they worked way harder than the average American, for much less than the average American, in circumstances that the average American would never work at. The Chinese built the railroads that really helped the